Velkommen til dette felles arrangementet mellom Senter for rus- og avhengighetsforskning, SERAF, og Statens institutt for rusmiddelpolitikk, SIRUS. Resten av det jeg skal si skal foregå på engelsk. So, welcome everybody, and welcome Professor David Nutt. We're very honored to have you here. We're very much looking forward to, and as you can see, a big audience, many are looking forward to your talk on this important topic, the dangers of drugs. Many of us have been inspired to come here today because of your brilliant book, and the ones who haven't read it or haven't read my writing about it in Rus og Samfunn, which is a very good magazine that you should read, can read about it there, where I did some writing about it. When I was going to introduce David today, I was thinking, how should I do this? And being the son of an economist, I thought about a joke. I thought about the old Norwegian Nobel Prize laureate in economics, Ragnar Frisch. He was a man who had several jokes. All of them very educational, all of them with a point to elaborate on. And this joke is about a guy who walks down at the harbor. And out in the water, he hears somebody crying for help. This person is crying for help. And some of the people on the pier, they say, "Well, do something." And then this one guy, he looks around, he sees a wrench and skiftnøkkel. He picks it up and he throws it out and hits the guy on the head. This is not a very funny joke, but it's a joke about trying to do something and trying to come across as having done something, no matter what it is. And I think this is appropriate to talk about. Looking into today's topic, looking at, for example, the legal status of different narcotics drugs. People are constantly doing something in order to do something. Now, in this context, you, David, you're the guy who comes and tells us that we should look for something that's better than a wrench to throw out. We shouldn't do just something, we should try to do the sensible thing. Maybe we don't have the answers altogether to what to do, but we could do better than a wrench. We could have some more sanity put into some of the decisions we do within the drug abuse field. And you've been in a lot of discussions on this topic, what to do and why to do this, and I hope when having gone through today's lectures, we will know something more about what would be maybe more sensible ways to act in this complex field. Maybe not having the final answer, but some more sense. I've heard you many times, David, speak on this and other topics, and I know you're a very good lecturer. As you're a good author of books, I went down to Nyholt here today to see if they had this book, and they didn't have a book. But I said that you should order this now because there will be a lot of people coming asking for this book in the coming weeks. Some household matters. We're a lot of people here in a small room, and I can feel already it's going to get very hot. We have the windows open, but if you can't hear what's being said, well, we may have to shut them, but try to keep them open during the talk. I see that people have started shutting them already. You talk loud.
I talk loud.
Yes, so you'll be able to hear David anyway. If people need toilets, they're down the hall that way, and we will keep on this session with David talking for approximately, maybe a little less than 1 hour, and after that there will be possibilities for questions, and we will hopefully have a fruitful discussion afterwards for 30-35 minutes after that. So if you could hold your questions until then, write them down on a piece of paper. I think that's the best way to organize such a big crowd with so many knowledgeable and interested people. So with these words, David, I'm happy again to have you here, and I'm looking very much forward to your lecture, so please.
Thank you very much. Jørgen? Oh, you want to broadcast me, do you? Okay.
Yeah, it's someone out in the hall that doesn't
Yes.
hear everything. Just see if this helps.
Okay, you can hear me better out there? In the hallway?
I'll switch it on.
Oh, yeah.
But you can just...
Well, it's great to be here. Let me kick off. I haven't been here for, I think, over 20 years, so it's nice to be back. And it's nice to have this invitation to talk to you about a topic that I've done a lot of thinking about over the years, but certainly not yet that have managed to change government perceptions, even if I have managed to change public perceptions. So I'm always hopeful that wherever country I go to, they may take up the challenge and forge ahead. And I suspect Norway is actually likely to be a bit more receptive to some of the messages than an old-fashioned country like Britain. So let me start by some fundamentals. I'm a psychopharmacologist, psychiatrist. What is a drug? We're concerned about drugs. And actually, who should say what a drug is? Now, this is what a pharmacologist thinks. I don't know, do we have any pharmacologists in the audience? Yes. A drug is something that, when given to a rat, results in a scientific paper. That is a very efficient way of getting a big CV. This is my definition of a drug. Something a politician once used but now regrets. Now that may only be appropriate in the USA and in the UK. It may not be true here, I don't know. But I'll just share a couple of examples. So, a previous Home Secretary, so this, I don't know what the equivalent in Norway would be. Minister of the Interior, yeah, okay. When she was appointed to Home Secretary, they asked her the standard question, did you ever take drugs? And she said, well, I smoked cannabis, but I didn't enjoy it. And kind of think, why bother? And I've never had a chance to ask her that question, but I think if I did, she'd say to me, because that's what everyone did in Oxford in those days. It was the only way to become a member of the Labour Party. And then this man here, some of you may recognise him, there's a younger David Cameron. He's our Prime Minister now. And he was asked the question, and he said, I did things when young that I shouldn't have. We all did. Now, we in that context actually is a very special we. It's called the Eton we. Eton being a very special school where David and his mates, who now run the country, went. Now the thing about David was that even though he didn't tell us what he did, other people have, and I can tell you what he did. He did a number of drugs, and they all began with the same letter as his last name, the letter C. So, let's get to the serious question now. Why do we control drugs? Well, we control them because they're harmful. In many countries, we control them because they might be harmful. In my country, we control drugs because the media wants us to control drugs. And many politicians see drug control as an easy way of winning votes. And some of the public go along with that. So this is obviously a wide range of different motives. And some are good, and some are not so good. And policy has to try to dissect out the good from the bad. And if we aspire to having drug laws which are based on harm, which of course is what I'm sure all countries try to do, with possible exception of some Islamic countries, we want to know the best we can about the harms of drugs. And that's not so easy, because when you ban a drug, you immediately find it difficult to get data on the drug. And of course, some harms occur simply as a consequence of a drug being made illegal. And you can think, obviously, of diseases like HIV, which are largely driven by the illegal use of dirty needles. And of course, when new drugs come along to circumvent the law, we're in an even worse position, because we often know nothing whatsoever about them. So it seems to me there are 4 key issues that we have to discuss in relation to this topic. The relative harms of drugs, and all drugs, including alcohol and tobacco, must be considered. We should compare comparative harms, because drug taking is just but one of many other activities that people engage in because they're pleasurable and are risky. And then the bottom 2, I won't be talking about today, the proportionality of penalties in relation to health harms, and the benefit-harm equation, and that's one of the interesting challenges. And those are very, very difficult topics, and there's not been a great deal of work done on them. And so I think I'm parking those until we have a bit more time and opportunity. So I started working for the UK government as a drugs advisor in about 1993, when we had the first concerns about MDMA, ecstasy deaths. And that was quite an eye-opening experience, because I realised there was absolutely no science behind anything the government was doing in relation to drugs. And I went away and I started to work from about 1997 on this report here, the Runciman report. And this was probably the best thing I've ever been part of. Ruth Runciman was a very senior figure in sort of British thinking life. She chaired this committee, which was set up by a charity to review the harms of drugs in relation to the law. And I was the doctor on that committee. And when I explained to this range of experts, from philosophers through to lawyers, journalists, how there was no systematic way of assessing the harms of drugs, they thought I was mad. How could that be? How could scientists not know how to assess the harms of drugs? So they told me to go away and get it sorted. So as part of that committee, if you read that report, you will see the beginnings of the scale of harm that I've worked on ever since. And because that report was both very good and also very logical, it was extremely well received by the media. Strange things happened. Newspapers said, well, this is great, but you haven't gone far enough. We should be legalising all drugs. We thought, oh, that's sort of interesting, but that's not quite what we were saying yet. And that was in 2000. But the political landscape changed, and within a few years we're being vilified for even suggesting that cannabis might be downgraded. So we learned, that taught us one thing, that you certainly can't rely on the media having any memory. It changes almost daily. But because of that report, I was asked to chair the UK government's committee that assesses the harms of drugs, that makes decisions about whether a drug should be made illegal or not. So I chaired that committee for 9 years. And I took that job on the condition that I was allowed to develop a systematic way of assessing the harms of drugs, which I did. And I used the 9-point scale, and eventually the paper was published, and there it is in the Lancet 2007, developing a rational scale for assessing the harms of drugs. It took a long time. It's not an easy process to do, to get experts to agree. The committee didn't meet more than 4 times a year, so we had to do this as intermittently. But eventually we took all these drugs, including legal drugs such as alcohol and tobacco and cat and solvents, and we put those in because we thought it was important, first for the public to know that they're drugs, and second because they do provide some anchor points, because they're legal, we do have better data on them. And we assessed them all on this 9-point scale. So this was a scale I had sort of plucked from first principles as part of the Runciman report. And I divided up the harms of drugs into 3 main categories: physical harm, dependence, and social harm. And each of those 3 categories had 3 separate parameters. And each of those was scored from 0 to 3. So the maximum score for any drug was 27. And we used a Delphic process because for most of these drugs we don't have a lot of data on some of these areas. We essentially used the best estimates of a series of expert using a Delphic process, where essentially people share their opinions and you come to a consensus. Now, as part of that process, we did discover that there was some data. Not strong data, but potentially very important data. And one set of data are deaths. So these are the UK data on reports of deaths from drugs. And what we were able to do was look at the number of deaths and then make an estimate from either from police seizures or from questionnaire data on the number of users. And this concept of index of toxicity, deaths per million users, was developed by Les King, who was part of our group. And you can see that there is an enormous disparity between heroin and all other drugs. And what makes it extremely clear that heroin is a very, very dangerous drug. And those are deaths from overdose. And of course, those are deaths from injection. So that's one important message here, is that even if you get rid of the ancillary harms of heroin, such as HIV risk, people still die as a result of taking it. So let no one have any impression that heroin could ever be a safe drug. In fact, people die in hospitals when doctors give them heroin because it is such a potent respiratory depressant. So that's one set of data which we could put into our analysis. We can also look at drug-related deaths. So these are deaths which are not caused directly by the drug, but are caused by the drug then damaging the body, like tobacco causing lung cancer or heart disease. So these are UK data. And one of the interesting issues for me, actually, as you hear what I'm saying, I'd be fascinated to know if there are any anomalies on our analysis which the Norwegian experience would throw up. Because it may be that there are important lessons we could learn from countries with different use of drugs and different approaches to protecting people from their health. So here you see in the UK about 80,000 people a year die of tobacco-related disorder. About half of all smokers die of a smoking-related disease, but they tend to die old. Alcohol, about 8,000 deaths, spread right across from 13-year-olds right through to 80-year-olds. Opiates, about 1,000 deaths, mostly heroin, but about a third of those deaths are methadone. And then paracetamol overdose, then cocaine, amphetamines. And you can see that cannabis, ecstasy, and methadone are very low. Jørgen admitted the usual intro that I get. He normally says that I'm the UK drugs advisor that was sacked by the government. And so I'm telling you that now in case some of you didn't know that. And I was sacked in 2009 for saying that, looking at this graph here, if you were the health minister, what would you want to change? Well, you know, it's obvious that you want to be doing something about tobacco and alcohol if you were serious about the harms of drugs. And what I was arguing that we had a peculiar focus on cannabis and ecstasy, which I thought was irrational, and in fact I thought was actually deceitful, because I knew it was happening because the government was hoping that they could ignore the deaths on the left by focusing public concern about the drugs on the right. And that was why I was said. So let's just say a few things about tobacco and health. As you know, it's the largest killer worldwide in terms of drugs. Over 5 million premature deaths a year. And it kills across a range of different disorders: ischemic heart disease, cerebrovascular disease, chest disease, obstructive chest disease. So you can see those are the contributions to the total deaths from those different uses, the different harms of tobacco. And what was interesting, and I don't know if the same is true in this country, in the UK, that has been generally accepted. Tobacco is lethal with prolonged use in many people. And we are doing something about it. We've started to tax tobacco to a point where its use has gone down. And we've actually banned advertising, trying to stop young people using it. And there's been some success there. I've been particularly intrigued by these data from on the use of snus in Sweden, and I believe it's also legal here as well. I mean, snus is one of the most remarkable inventions in the history of medicine, because snus has actually dramatically reduced the damage from tobacco in Sweden. And it doesn't cause lung cancer, it doesn't cause heart disease. It's at least 20 times safer than smoking. This particular Swedish form of snus, which has taken out many of the carcinogens. And that's one of the reasons the Swedes are some of the longest lived people in the world. And they have, by far and away, the lowest rates of lung cancer in Europe. Now, to my mind, snus is a brilliant example of how you analyse a problem, people like nicotine, and find a delivery system that minimises harm. And I think one of the greatest criticisms one could make of the European Union is that it has not allowed snus to be used outside Sweden. And of course you don't have to worry about this because you're not in the European Union. But what's remarkable is the argument they use, which is that selling snus would undermine the competitiveness of the tobacco industry in Europe. That is the argument. In fact, they tried. When Sweden joined the EU, they tried to get Sweden to ban snus. And thankfully the Swedes stood up against it. So this is a truly outrageous denial of something, one of the great health prevention measures by the European Union, and driven simply by the lobby from the tobacco industry. And also, and you may not know this, but we still subsidise the growing of tobacco in Europe, in Greece and in Italy. But that's politics. Now, one of the things we did when I produced this chart, we analysed the 20 drugs, we gave them scores, and then we decided we wanted to be sure that our experts weren't a strange bunch of people that had kind of been cowed into submission by me. So we sent out a questionnaire asking all the addiction psychiatrists in the UK to rate drugs according to the same parameters and the same scale. And about half of them replied, which was actually remarkable, and it showed that I think they were interested in this. And we found there was really good concordance between the drug-treating psychiatrists and our experts. So we began to get some confidence that our analysis approach was valid. And this was the first chart. This was the first chart of drug ranking. And you can see that alcohol was 5th, heroin was 1st, cocaine 2nd, barbiturates 3rd, street methadone 4th, alcohol, and then tobacco about 10th and cannabis about 13th. We were surprised at how high alcohol came, and actually the media were very, very surprised, because people had up to that point assumed that because alcohol was legal, it was probably less harmful than all these illegal drugs. The coloured drugs are the ones that are illegal. But there was criticism of the approach, which was, I think, quite fair. Essentially, each parameter was weighted equally. So, and that was because we had to start somewhere, and we didn't really know how to do it better. And there was also another question. We only took 9 harms. Are those the right harms? We're obviously collapsing a lot of harms into single harm. Social harm encompasses a number of different dimensions. And although most people were, certainly most scientists were comfortable with the results, they seemed to make sense, it was still a subject of debate, and people were able to dismiss the conclusions on the grounds that we hadn't done it optimally. But soon after that report was published, I was contacted by a guy from the LSE called Larry Phillips, who said, I know a way of doing it a lot better. And he met with me and one of the other authors of that report, which is, I should have pointed out, that one of the authors of the report was the chair of the Medical Research Council in the UK at the time, Colin Blakemore. So it did have considerable support from the scientific establishment. And he met with us and he said, could we get funding to do it properly? And doing it properly involves using a technique called multi-criteria decision analysis, which I'll talk you through in a minute. And we received funding from the Medical Research Council and the Home Office, Department of the Interior, to do this. And the first thing we did was organise a conference of experts to look at what harms of drugs we should consider. And we did this absolutely from the bottom up. And we, over the course of a day, we came up with every single harm any of us could think of that the drug could do. And then the next day we collapsed them into a series of separate parameters or criteria. And these are they. We think you can analyse the harms of all drugs, according to these 16 criteria, 9 of which relate to the person using them, and 7 relate to society or other people. And they range from physical harms, such as whether the drug will kill you, like heroin does intravenously, whether the drug will cause damage as a result of using dirty needles, whether the drug can cause mortality from cirrhosis, etc. And then the psychological elements, the social elements to the individual, how you narrowing of people's social repertoire, etc. And then the social harms, crime, environmental damage, family adversity, international damage, economic cost, and community damage. So these we believe to be that's the full spectrum of harms that any drug can produce. And as I've said, some of these have very hard data. We know the deaths. So tobacco deaths, for instance, these are drug-related deaths. They're not drug-specific deaths. People don't die instantly when they smoke. Whereas opiates, a lot of these are due to overdose, so drug-specific deaths. I'll come back and explain that in a bit more detail. I don't know, was she popular here?
Yes.
So Amy Winehouse is a very interesting example of an alcohol-specific death. And I just want to spend a few words talking about her, because she's not only one of the many examples of talented performers who've died of a drug overdose, but she's one of the ones that died of alcohol. And people don't usually talk about alcohol deaths. But in the UK, 3 young people a week die just of alcohol poisoning, like Amy Winehouse. And her blood alcohol level was 450 milligrams percent, which is 5.5 times our legal driving limit, equivalent to about a litre of vodka. And that's a lethal level in someone who isn't an experienced drinker. But what was particularly intriguing about Amy's death was that according to our current government policy, she was recovered. So we have now a policy which I'm working hard to get changed, but we have a desire in our government to do away with treatment of addiction and replace it with the concept of a lifestyle choice that people can give up easily. And we've got an excessive focus on this concept of recovery, which is abstinence. Now, Amy met criteria for recovery. She'd been clean, dry, whatever you call it, for a couple of months. But she also exhibits the classic issue, the classic problem of abstinence-based recovery, which is if you relapse, then you're more likely to die. And that's well established with drugs like heroin, but it's much less talked about with drugs like alcohol. So she's a phenomenal opportunity for all of you to explain to young people how dangerous alcohol is. These are the latest data in the UK. These are truly chilling data. Alcohol now in the UK is the most common reason for death in men under the age of 50. These are mortality rates. For men 16 to 24 is 23%. So this is the 20% cause of death rate. So there's no question in anyone's mind, I think, that alcohol is one of the big killers, and certainly in men currently in the UK. I don't know what the data is in Norway, but I would bet it wasn't that different. You probably just haven't analysed it. Of course, there are worse countries. This is Russia. This is Russia looking at the life expectancy over the last 50 years in men and women. And I guess Norway probably is at the top end of the curve in Europe. I imagine that your life expectancy is now pushing up to about 80 for men and about 86, 7 for women. You can see that life expectancy in Russia has not gone up for either men or women. In fact, it's gone down. And it showed these remarkable dips. And these dips are totally driven by alcohol policy. So we have, if there is no issue that alcohol is a massive cause of death. These are the Russian data looking at poisoning deaths and life expectancy at birth in Russia. And they show that there is a remarkable parallelity. The more people get poisoned by alcohol, the shorter the life expectancy. And these bars here represent changes. So this here, this bar here, was when Gorbachev, at a stroke, decreed that this mortality from alcohol, this rise of poisonings, had to stop. So he said, we will produce half as much vodka next year. And as soon as vodka production, which is all state controlled, halved, deaths dropped almost instantly. And life expectancy. And then, of course, he was kicked out, and the policy reversed. And that is truly, if anyone wants any, visual evidence that alcohol kills you, that truly is it. And these data, some of you may have seen from the WHO recently, looked at global disability in young people. I've highlighted Europe in the middle here. Green bar is alcohol. For men, you can see in Europe, something like 75% of all the disability in young people due to alcohol, and it's about 20% for the women. And overall, in the world, alcohol is the main cause of disability. The reasons for that in our country are obvious. We have an alcohol policy which has utterly failed. So these are the most recent data we have on drinking in school children. Girls 54%, boys 50%. Intoxicated, so putting themselves at risk from accidents and from sexual violence, etc. Half are drunk once a month. 3 years before they're allowed to buy alcohol. But what's terrifying is that has been the same for the last 15 years since we started collecting data. So we have known why alcohol is killing people from 16 to 54. We just have chosen to do nothing about it. It's because people are drinking very heavily before they're even allowed to drink. And we do nothing about it at all. And as a result of that very significant increase in consumption in young people, we now have these very, very chilling data in the UK, and I would be really interested to know whether it's the same in Norway. So these are standardized mortality rates from a whole range of different ways of dying, from blood disease, diabetes, endocrine diseases. And you can see from 1970 to the latest data we have, 2006, standardized mortality rates for all those other disorders have gone down, usually by about 50%. So that's because medicine's getting better and we're getting healthier. The only organ system which has gone in the opposite direction is deaths from liver disease. And they've gone up 5-fold. And 80% of that is alcohol and 20% hepatitis. So we have an epidemic of deaths from liver disease, largely driven by alcohol. It is estimated that within this decade, liver disease will kill more men than heart disease. And we do absolutely nothing about it. In fact, we deny it's happening because it's politically inexpedient to face up to the power of the drinks industry. And it's even worse in Scotland. So you may have heard that Scotland is trying to separate and become like you, a sort of independent power, free of Europe. But Scotland's also trying to bring in a policy that regulates the cost of alcohol. And these data are fascinating for several reasons. I started in medicine in 1970. Started to see patients about 1972. And then cirrhosis was something that the French had. It was quite rare. If you saw some, I can remember exactly. I can remember seeing my patient with cirrhosis and ascites and examining them And that was it. That was my education on cirrhosis in Guy's Hospital in London in 1972. Because European countries like France had tenfold higher rates than we have. The French have brought down their rates of cirrhosis dramatically by sensible policies largely relating to the pricing control of alcohol. We have lost control. Scotland now has the highest binge drinking rates in the world, apart from Russia, and the highest cirrhosis rates. And this is why they're trying to bring in new policies, because it is destroying the health services. What this big rise in damage, paradoxically, has not come from a massive rise in consumption. In the UK, I showed you the beginnings of the standardised mortality in 1970 to the latest data. Alcohol consumption has gone up less than twofold. There's been about only a 60% rise in net alcohol consumption in the country. It's been driven by two factors. This rise here was driven by taking alcohol out of licensed premises and giving it to supermarkets. And this rise here was given by a very cynical approach of the drinks industry to make very strong beers and ciders, which were very low priced because they were under a tax threshold. So in Britain now you can buy 8% cider for about a sixth the price of 8% wine, and which makes it extremely cheap. And that increase, but even just a 60% increase in alcohol consumption has led to a massive increase in hospital admissions and those deaths from liver disease. And that's kind of worrying, that alcohol has such a steep relationship between consumption and harm. And of course, when we're looking at the broader issue of alcohol, I showed you some of the social harms relate to, or the harms to others relate to environmental damage. And here's an example of alcohol-related environmental damage. Before the Gulf oil spill, this was the largest, most severe environmental catastrophe, man-made environmental catastrophe. The Exxon Valdez smashing into the coast of Alaska because the captain was drunk. And we also see some very damaging impacts on politicians. We've had a number of MPs, talented politicians whose careers have been terminated by drinking. This is the most remarkable example, where the Polish government died a couple of years ago because the head of the Air Force insisted that a plane land in fog in the Ukraine when the pilot said he couldn't. But the head of the Air Force was drunk and overruled the pilot. So they wiped out the whole of their parliament. Here's one of our local MPs, just been kicked out of parliament for fighting drunk in parliament. I don't know about your parliament, but in our parliament we have 5 bars in our parliament. And they're all subsidised by the taxpayer. And you wonder why politicians don't stand up to the drinks industry, because they're actually in their pocket. And even when you go to Ascot and you wear proper uniform, you can scan. This illustrates one other point, that the worst people to get into fights with are people with champagne bottles, because they're very, very heavy and they can do a lot of damage when they hit one. And one of the real questions that fascinates me is why, in the face of that tsunami of harm from alcohol, why does no one do anything? And the last Labour government said, well, we're not going to do anything because there are health benefits of alcohol. And therefore we cannot adjudicate between the benefits which the industry promotes and the harms which you doctors tell us about. So let's look at the health benefits of alcohol. So what you see here, on the left-hand side are the lives saved through drinking alcohol. And on the right-hand side are the lives lost through drinking alcohol. So you don't need statistics. You can see that the lives lost massively, massively outweigh the lives saved. And the lives lost are particularly in young people. And the other point, which is not made, certainly not by the industry, is the optimal dose of alcohol for a health benefit is 5 grams a day. It's almost impossible. We'll try it tonight. Can we buy just 5 grams of alcohol as a single drink? I think we should have a new way of work. We should actually buy 1 glass of alcohol with 3 straws and share. That would actually make them. That way you could have the benefit without that. But this is that small amount of benefit, which is probably less in women, is the justification for doing nothing. And the drinks industry are so clever. In the UK, they have now persuaded people that what we as doctors said was the upper threshold for safety, a threshold of consumption which doubled your risk of dying, they now turn that into the aspirational target for consumption to get the health benefits. So, some examples of the kind of harms that drugs do, but focusing on the most harmful one, alcohol. This is the new model. This is the model that uses multi-criteria decision analysis, a process which allows us to essentially equate Exxon Valdez against someone dying from an injection too much heroin. The methodology has been established for about 30 years. Apparently it's widely used by companies, pharmaceutical companies and others, to actually make rational decisions about investments. But it's not really been used in the health sphere very much. And essentially, the bottom line is it's a way of allowing comparisons across areas of interest which have very different metrics, where you have numbers in some and you have opinions in others. This is an example of how it works. Apparently, this is a true picture taken by Larry Phillips himself when he was somewhere in Colorado. Gold Hill, established 1859, elevation 8,463, population 118, total. Bigger the number, the better in America. So, we want to compare apples and oranges, and we do it in the context of the value, what we care about in terms of the different parameters. So essentially what we did was we looked at the harms across those 16 separate sets of criteria. We used almost the same 20 drugs as we used before. We didn't use exactly the same ones because this new drug, methadone, had come along, which wasn't around at the time. So, but essentially it's the same number. And the way you do it is this. If you after this you're not so sure, you can ask Jørgen, because we took him away to Brussels last week and we spent 2 days doing this with a European group from 20 different European countries. Fascinating exercise. But the principle is this. For any of the parameters, you score according to you find the most harmful drug, and you put it as 100. And then you look at all the other drugs, and you relate them as a proportion of the most harmful. So a drug that scores 50 is half as harmful. So it's a ratio scale. And then the power of a ratio scale is that you can scale across different kinds of parameters. Let me give you an example of this then. So this is drug-specific mortality. The likelihood of the drug killing you. Well, I've already shown you the data. Heroin, 20,000 deaths per million users, and most of them. So acute death. So heroin scores 100%. The most harmful drug. The drug most likely to kill you as a result of using the drug directly. And tobacco scores 0. You know what? As far as we know, no one's ever died from smoking cigarettes. However, if you look at drug-related mortality, the likelihood of the use of a drug over a period killing you, then heroin's still number 1, but tobacco is getting very close. Because tobacco, well, you might argue it should be higher, because half of all smokers die of tobacco-related disease. So that's an example of the 2 of those parameters. And then, and this is the really clever part, having worked out the scaling of all the different drugs on those 16 different parameters, that's a lot of work. Once you've done that, you can then weight the parameters. You can ask the question, what do you, as Norwegians, think is more important? Drug-related deaths or drug-specific deaths? Environmental damage versus economic damage. So you can weight the criteria. And that's essentially about the value judgment. How much do you care about the difference in drug-related deaths from the economic damage? And what you do is you do that systematically. You take each cluster and you work out the ranking there, and then you compare between the clusters, and eventually you come to the one that's most highly ranked. Let me give you an example of this then. So here we're weighting harms to others. We're weighting 6 parameters of harms to others. Crime, environmental damage, family adversity, international damage, economic cost, and community damage. And in the UK, so this is the UK group, we thought that alcohol was the most damaging to communities, it was the most economically damaging, crack was the most internationally damaging, alcohol was the most damaging to families, environmentally alcohol was the most damaging, and crime, heroin was the most damaging. And at the bottom, we put the drugs which we thought were least damaging. So we didn't think there was any crime from butane sniffing. There was no environmental damage from benzos. There was no family adversity from people taking mushrooms. And then we asked the question, which of those do we care about most? And in the UK, we cared most about economic harm from alcohol, because in the UK, alcohol costs the British economy £30 billion a year. So we scored about 100, and then we scaled the others according to that. The next most harmful one we thought was crime. We thought that we cared about that 80% as much as we cared about the economic cost. Environmental damage, which is like people vomiting in the streets, etc., we didn't care so much about that. We put that as 30. Family adversity, we cared quite a lot about that. We put that as 70. International damage, where we were maybe a bit parochial. We didn't worry too much about that. And community damage, we didn't score very highly. And having done that, you essentially scale across the 16 parameters all in proportion to that 100 of economic costs. It turns out, when we do this, that in the UK, we put economic cost as being about 13% of the total burden, injury, 11.5%, crime, 10%, etc. You can see how the figures build up with those. So the different criteria are weighted quite differently. Some are weighted up to, as I say, 13% of the total, others down to a very small amount, 3%. And from that, we produce this chart. Now this chart is color-coded to separate the harm to the user, the sums of those 9 variables, and the harm to society, the red bars. And what is interesting is that, and I have to say, completely unpredicted, we didn't anticipate this, but alcohol came out on top as overall most harmful because of this very high level of harm to other people, to society. This is a way of plotting it on 2 dimensions. You see harms to users, methamphetamine, crack, heroin, very high, alcohol, pretty high, harms to others, alcohol way up there, because of the vast use of alcohol in society. Why is alcohol so harmful? Well, economic cost is enormous, injury to people is enormous, family adversity is very high, and then the other scales, crime, drug-related mortality, score less. But about half of all the harms of alcohol come into this top 4. We wanted to validate this. We wanted to see whether we were really so far off the mark that people wouldn't think this was credible. And we looked at 1 or 2 other groups. There's a group in the Netherlands, Jan van Amsterdam and colleagues, who've been trying to do something similar with a similar range of drugs. And they'd come up with the same kind of construct, that there was population damage from drugs and individual damage, and we correlated ours with theirs. We found the correlations were actually really rather good. We also looked at the correlation between our scores and our previous scores in the 2007 paper, and they were also not bad. We looked at some other published studies. We looked at this question of just the lethality of drugs, because we know we can get data on that. We can get data on that from animals, from rats, but we can also get some data from humans. And there was a reasonable correlation between the drugs that Gable had done and what we had done. And in terms of mortality and fatality, there was only 5 drugs that had been looked at in the King and Corkery paper, but there's a very strong correlation with our scores. And this very famous paper, this was an interesting paper, because when we tried to publish the first Lancet paper in 2007, people did not want it published. The referees were caustic. And one of them said, "Oh, it's all been done before. Anthony et al. Did it in 1994. And we said, well, hang on a second, we're talking about 2007 now, you know. And also they did 5 drugs and we did 20 drugs. How could you possibly say it's all been done before? But there was an enormous resistance to publishing that paper. And I have to give credit to the Lancet editors, because they saw that the responses were largely political, not scientific. And they, having published the first paper, they actually asked us to publish the second paper. And of course, the most important, to my mind, was the correlation with our current drug laws, which is 0. And that tells us that our drug laws are not scientific, and therefore the law is unjust. And one should be trying to make laws just. So that is I think that is the key message. But it also asks the question about why do we have our drug laws? I mean, I imagine I know that our drug laws have emerged from the international UN conventions on drugs, and they are similarly wrong. And it really is time to do something about them. And maybe Norway could actually take an international lead in it. I mean, you have a reputation as a country for taking the lead on difficult issues. You've tried to solve the Palestinian problem, and but you try. You tried. I mean, and I will give you a lot of credit for trying. Because most people said it was insoluble, and you have tried. And so why don't you try now to solve the drug problem? There's an opportunity. The UN General Assembly 2016 will review the drug laws. It needs some countries to get in there and say they're rubbish, and we will give you a better set of laws. And maybe you could do that. And of course, the other point that came out from our analysis in the UK is that alcohol should be the major target for harm reduction. If you care about the harms of drugs, you must care about alcohol. And that was a message. The government didn't like it. As I say, it helped get me sacked. And they've continued to ignore it. In fact, they've gone the other way. In the last month's budget, they actively reduced the taxation of alcohol. Almost spiteful. What are the next steps? Well, there are a few of them. We can improve the harms model. As more evidence becomes available, drugs will change. The more we know about new drugs, the more we will get confident in our decision making. One of the challenging things is to try to broaden the model into another couple of dimensions. Can we add the political dimension? Could we get lawyers to do this? Could we actually find out what other groups would score? I mean, it would be fantastic. I've offered this to the Houses of Parliament. I've said, I will come and we will do this with you. You can learn how to do this, be part of the process, do the weightings yourself. Because this is the powerful technology. You don't need to know about the drugs to do the weightings. The weightings are all opinion-based. But they've always refused because I guess it would be too challenging to show I was right. We want to consult other expert panels and different countries, and we started doing this. We managed to get a European grant, and we had a European conference last week, in which Jørgen was present. 20 countries doing this across Europe. Great experience, challenging. Very, very different kinds of drug problems in different countries. So it's much harder to do across Europe than just in the UK. But we did it, and we will be publishing that soon. One very important issue is the relationship between the harms from the drugs and the harms from the laws that relate to the drugs. And obviously, as I've mentioned already, the most obvious one relates to the illegality leading to shared needles, etc., with HIV. If we took that into consideration, then there would probably there'd be maybe even greater difference between drugs like alcohol and drugs like heroin. And then, of course, there's a really challenging issue about the benefits of drugs, which even I haven't kind of had the strength and energy to get into yet. But I'd like someone to take that up, because there is another dimension, you know, of potential benefits. And here's an example. This is one of the great natural experiments that I've ever seen in my life. So we had a drug called mephedrone come to the UK in about 2006. Mephedrone is a kind of cocaine sort of stimulant sort of analog. But do you have it here? Do you have much of it here? And but it was legal, so it was sold over the internet, and it became very, very popular. And eventually, after the government banned it, they sacked me, and then they banned mephedrone on the grounds that, well, they banned it because the newspapers didn't like it, and the newspapers invented stories about it killing people, and so it got banned. But after it got banned, these data came out. So these are cocaine deaths in the UK. So from here, you know, I've been working, trying to reduce this. This graph was going up and up year on year, and the government was trying to get cocaine deaths down. And we had no, as far as I can see, no impact on it whatsoever. But as soon as the market starts to flog a safer cocaine, people switch. So here you have 40 fewer cocaine deaths, largely because people have switched from cocaine, which is relatively toxic, to mephedrone, which is less toxic. So however many people died of mephedrone, maybe 3 or 4 or 10, I don't know, many more cocaine lives were saved. So this is kind of paradoxical discovery. It's like methadone saving heroin deaths. But it's all been done by the market. There's no political interference in this whatsoever. It's a fascinating example of unpredicted consequences of giving people choice. And the lesson there is, basically, the safer the drug that people use, the less they're likely to die. Okay, I'm going to stop now. Jørgen's already publicised my book. I'll just emphasise something he didn't say, that all the profits go to a charity. So when I was sacked by the government, I decided to set up an independent charity called the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs, to do what the government should be doing, tell the truth about drugs. Most of the scientists who were on the government's committee resigned and joined my committee. So now this is where people go to. This is where the media go to find out anything about drugs. There's almost no interest in what the government committee says because no one can trust it. So if you do buy the book, you're supporting that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I suppose there are questions. I should add, though, there's a website, a very nice website for this. You can go online and find information about different things there. So you should try to visit that for more information. I want to introduce Ingeborg Rossow from SIRUS. She will lead the discussion, and I will try to help one another on this. But you will be sitting up here, and I will be in the neighborhood also. So please, Ingeborg, for the discussion.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you so much, David, for your very interesting and thought-provoking speech today. Do I need this? I do prepare some questions or challenges for you, but I do have the impression that there are some eager members of the audience who would like to say something. So I would like to invite the audience first to come with questions or comments. And before posing your question, could you please give your name and your affiliation? You in the blue shirt first.
My name is Ululan, and I'm a writer. And I like writing on drugs because the policies are so crazy, and they're crazy here as well. The way you describe between the relationship between harm and laws,
Yes.
then become unjust. First of all, thank you for your book. It was a relief to read that book and also to read your Lancet articles. Very much so. Put things in perspective. My question is, why does governments, and particularly Western governments, including the Norwegian governments, tend to ignore their own expert panels on drugs? This has been going on since 1894 with the British Hemp Commission, and it happened last time in 2011 here in Norway, where our former State Secretary, Foreign Minister Thorvald Stoltenberg led a group that actually recommended legalizing or regulating cannabis within the law instead of outside of it. And this goes into the dimension of the political harm that hasn't been addressed. But
that's another question. Okay, let me answer your question then.
Yes, the question
so
is,
why don't they?
It is like this, with a massive pressure from people knowing better, including
well,
scientists.
And the answers are very complex. And I mean, obviously, at the top level, the answer is they're politicians and they want to get re-elected, and that's all they care about. At another level, they're also ignorant because they don't bother to find out what the truth is. So maybe what you should all do, buy a copy of my book and each one of you send it to your local politician. The third is that many of them have got very powerful links with the drinks industry. The drinks industry is one of the cleverest industries, maybe the best industry ever at pulling the wool over people's eyes. The fourth is that they are told by civil servants that they can't do anything anyway because they've signed up to the conventions and you cannot break the conventions. And why the civil servants tell them this is unclear, but I think it's because they're lazy and they actually can't be bothered to rewrite the conventions.
And it's not true.
And of course it's not true, but that's what they say. And then I think also that they're, a lot of them are of a generation where the only drugs were alcohol and tobacco, so they hadn't really. But the saddest thing, actually, the saddest thing is that the younger generation of politicians, like David Cameron, who was a heavy drug user at school and at university, now refuses to admit to that, and also is pursuing this outmoded policy, which even 10 years ago he said was essentially flawed. Now he's just given in to the pressure from some of the media, and there is a very small but very powerful group of media, mostly newspaper editors, that I think they see getting drugs banned as one of their great challenges, and I think they give themselves an extra badge on their epaulette every time they get a drug ban, because it's one of the few things that newspapers can have any kind of role in anymore. So it's a really complicated mixture. It's a sort of perfect storm of negativity.
Thank you. We have a next question from Jørgen. And please, anyone else in the audience, give me a sign if you have something to say.
Yeah, my name is Ole Røberg, and I am an economist, and I have a question, because the two Lancet articles, the counter argument that I most commonly hear when I see people arguing against these articles as a way to sort of change the drug laws, is that they're largely driven by prevalence. That the reason alcohol scores so high is because alcohol is so large, and that if we relax the drug laws or change the drug laws in some way, we're not going to get this positive harm reduction where people switch from good drugs from bad drugs to good drugs. We're going to get the old drugs and the new drugs in addition.
Going to increase the market. Yeah.
So that's the standard argument. So I was wondering if have you sort of looked into ways to sort of reduce this to a sort of per user basis?
It's one of the great fears, absolutely, and it happens all the time. Every time I give a talk, someone says, but if we make cannabis legal, people will just get drunk and get stoned. And I said, well, that doesn't happen. And in fact, the evidence is, of course, that it doesn't happen. It's just a myth. It's a fear. It's a fear of alcohol drinkers. I think, because we all know that doesn't happen. You look at a country like the Netherlands. They have considerably lower death rates from alcohol-related disorders than we do, despite the fact that cannabis has been decriminalised there for 25 years. So there's no evidence whatsoever of addiction. The second thing I would say is that if you switch from alcohol to cannabis, there will be less harms because cannabis is a less harmful drug. And we know that a significant proportion of people do switch. And the best evidence we have on this is just come recently from Colorado. So you probably all know that Colorado has made cannabis legal. But it made it medicinally available 5 years ago. And the latest data we have from road traffic deaths in Colorado shows over that period, while medicinal cannabis has been available, there's been a 17% drop in deaths from heavy drinking on the roads. And the only sensible explanation of that is that people have switched, and that less people are drinking and less people are driving under the effects of alcohol. So I think there would be net benefits. But I think that is predicated on one important aspect, which is that what you don't want to happen, certainly what I don't want to happen, is for a completely free market in drugs. So yeah, sure, if every drug that's available was actively marketed like alcohol, there would be more damage. I am not arguing for that. I'm arguing for some kind of regulated access, just like we used to have for alcohol. And I think we should get back to that in the UK for alcohol. I think we made bad decisions in terms of deregulating alcohol, and we could regulate drugs more rationally, like for instance they're doing in Uruguay or they're doing in the Netherlands now. And I think that would have a net benefit to society.
I have so far 3 more people on the list. Please give me a sign if you want to say something. Okay. Astrid first.
Could you speak up in front there because...
Okay. I wonder how you, because I mean most people they are smoking cannabis.
Yes.
And I wonder how you do, how you can separate tobacco-related drugs.
Yeah.
Like that's with and not and that you see that tobacco is killing you and not smoking cannabis.
No, absolutely. This is another argument. People say, well, if we liberalise the cannabis laws, then that might encourage more people to smoke tobacco because people will smoke tobacco inevitably when they smoke cannabis. Well, of course, that's wrong. That's just a tradition. In the USA, they don't. In the USA, they smoke cannabis neat. And neat cannabis is safer than cannabis smoked with tobacco for 2 reasons. One is that neat cannabis burns at a lower temperature than tobacco, and therefore you get less toxins into your lungs. And the second is that because it hasn't got nicotine, it's not as addictive. And of course the other thing you can do is you can use bongs and things. So there are perfectly sensible ways of getting around that problem. But it is an issue. I mean, we just need to educate people. I mean, what I like about the Dutch coffee shop model is that you have to go outside to smoke your cigarette.
But I was actually thinking about when you have your comparison of the harms of the drugs.
Yeah.
How you have you ever considered that cannabis, smoking cannabis, or in the way we are doing it, or people are doing it, could harm?
Of course we did. Of course, absolutely. And we wrote 3 reports on cannabis. They're all on the website, the government website. They're all very easy to understand. We took evidence from the British Lung Foundation. We looked in this in great detail. Cannabis is less harmful to the lungs than tobacco. That's a fact. It's less harmful to the heart than tobacco because there's less carbon monoxide. But the other really important variable, and this is not talked about so much, is that most people's cannabis smoking histories are shorter than their tobacco smoking histories. And that's for a number of reasons. Partly the legality of tobacco, partly the addictive power of nicotine, partly the nature of cigarettes, but also the fact that cannabis, actually, most people don't want to be stoned most of their life, and eventually people don't want to smoke it all the time. And so cannabis trajectories tend to be used to be 10 to 20 years rather than 40, 50 years like tobacco. And it's less addictive than tobacco. So all those factors, that's why there's so few deaths from cannabis, because most people give up and they've still got enough life left to get over any heart or lung problems.
Thank you. Astrid, I think you forgot to present yourself. It was now Astrid Renland, she's the editor of Rus og Samfunn, who was talking now. Please state your name and your affiliation when you want to say something. Hilde?
My name is Hilde Pape and I work here at this institute. I have a few comments on your very interesting lecture. First, I was very surprised by the fact that you noted that there were cannabis-related deaths. I've never heard of anything like that before. And then there is this other issue that you just touched upon, which has to do with whether drugs are substitutes or complements.
Yeah.
And research that has been done at this institute shows that at least among young people in Norway, in 70% of the cases where they use cannabis, they drink simultaneously. And the implication for policy depends on whether these drugs are substitutes or complements, and whether legalization of, for instance, cannabis would reduce the drinking rate.
Yeah.
But I have a more personal question for you. If you were to choose, what would you prefer? Using all your efforts in legalizing less harmful, now illegal drugs, or making the alcohol policy more restrictive?
Well, as a scientist, I would say making the alcohol policy more logical, more restrictive, because that would give them the biggest net benefit to health. If I was a philosopher, I would say the opposite.
So what are you?
To give people, well, it depends what the audience is. What is his audience? But I suppose I'm a doctor. I guess I'm a doctor first. You can't stop being a doctor. It kind of gets into, it's a bit of an addiction. But anyway, to answer your specific question, cannabis, the deaths from cannabis are rare, but they occur because cannabis increases blood pressure, and some people have heart attacks. So there's the estimates of deaths in the UK from cannabis, like 20 a year or something. I mean, occasionally mouth cancer. But I want to ask you a question now. So, where in your studies of people drinking and getting stoned, do they drink as much as they weren't getting stoned?
Pardon me?
Do they drink as much alcohol if they're stoned?
As they do get stoned?
Do they binge as... So, I mean, is it that they drink some alcohol and then top up with cannabis?
I don't know.
If they didn't have the cannabis, would they drink more alcohol? That's the key question.
I don't know, but it can't be taken for granted that the one drug is going to substitute the other if it's getting legalized. It can't be taken for granted. That's just my point.
Of course it can't. No. But I think the likelihood is, from what we know, that people would almost certainly reduce.
It might add up. I mean, it's just a possibility that it might.
Yeah. Okay. But this is an important point, and I think but it doesn't add up in quite the same way as alcohol would add up. So this is really important issue. You can't add cannabis to alcohol and say you're twice as drunk or stoned or intoxicated, and therefore you're at twice as much harm, because the harms of alcohol are non-linear. I didn't show you the graph, but it's a very steep curve. So 100 grams of alcohol a day increases your mortality by about 16-fold. 50 grams of alcohol a day increases your mortality by about 3-fold. So if you were to just do 50 grams of alcohol and add cannabis on top, you would almost certainly have much better health than if you did 100 grams of alcohol and no cannabis. So it doesn't add up in this. You're saying it adds up, but not in terms of health harm.
It might add up. That's
Well, it
my
might.
point.
I mean,
It
well,
might.
but that's, you see, well, and that's why you have data. You see, you've asked people, go and get the data. Do they? Our experience is not that with cannabis. It is with other. I mean, there are dangers. There's no question. Some of the deaths we see from drugs, like, well, some of the legal highs, are associated with people being very, very, very drunk, and they're not even knowing what they're taking. So one of my pleas to young people is, I say, don't drunk and drug. Because if you're drunk, you don't know what else you're going to take. So if you're going to choose a drug, if you're going to drink alcohol, try not to take other drugs with it, because the additive, especially if you take things like GHB, the additive effects those are more than additive. Anything else?
Well, yes, we have now we have 3 more people. But first, there is a lady sitting just in front of the blue door. Yeah.
Yes. My name is Rita. I'm from the Association for Humane Drug Policies in Norway.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. You mentioned price control as a regulative for alcohol. And I wonder if you think information or better information to the public can be as regulative or better.
Well, information is always necessary and useful, and I think absolutely morally correct. But a drug like alcohol is one of the reasons people drink is to lose control. So the idea that you can control alcohol intake simply by strength of will it's a myth that the alcohol industry has been perpetuating for a long time. We see it all now. Drink responsibly. Well, but the whole point about alcohol is so that you lose your sense of responsibility. So I think it's actually deceptive. So yeah, people need to know that. People need to know. And some of us can drink responsibly, but we know a lot of people can't because their biology is different. And so that, you know, education's not enough, and it could never be enough.
Then that's you again.
Ulula, yeah. Just a comment on responsible drinking, if I may, before my question here. I have a technique which is that I count the units of alcohol that I drink,
Yeah.
and when I lose count, that's when I've reached the limit. And you don't need to have an absolute number. When I start wondering, did I drink 4 or 5 or 5 or 6, that's the signal.
And that is a really clever approach, and that's an approach that many people use, and we try to train people to do it, absolutely. But the problem is, as you know, the problem is that a lot of people lose the interest in counting after the second glass. You're not one of them, but some are.
But you did have a question as
I do
well.
have a question. It's obvious to me that the drug bans function as social control. And this may be one of the too little discussed underlying reasons for the drug bans, at least for
Of course it.
the ban on cannabis in the USA against the Mexicans.
Absolutely, there's no question about that. Yeah.
So the question is, do you think it's an effective kind of social control? And if not, as I hope, what do you think the alternatives, good alternatives might be?
What, for social control?
Yeah. If there should be any, that's even a question in itself.
Well, I mean, that's
But
an
there
old.
is, and there always will be.
Well, I kind of hope we'd have a rational society where we didn't need social controls, you know, a bit like your society here. But putting that to one side, yeah. So yeah, absolutely, a lot of the drug laws are predicated on the fear that people will behave in a way which undermines traditional society. Absolutely, and cannabis is one. But the cannabis story is more complicated than that, because the cannabis story is also about maintaining the Drug Enforcement Agency in the USA after prohibition was done away with. So people, it was about job creation, and in fact, of course, now many of you know. I mean, you know, have you
Criminalizing radicals by Nixon in 1970.
to some extent now, but that was more psychedelics. But I mean, the cannabis. So the cannabis. If you've not seen it, there's just this amazing film called The House I Live In, which is a film about how drug crime in America has now become such a huge industry in terms of providing prisons, that the prison lobby now has almost the same weight in American government as the National Rifle Association, because there are whole communities dependent on the prisons in which they work. So you have to fill the prisons with drug users. And it is a terrifying example of how we've got it so wrong. We're creating drug laws simply to fuel prison population. It's a truly terrifying, absolutely brilliant film. I think it's called Eugene Jarecki, directed it. I think it won the documentary prize at Sundance. And that's an example of, you know, drugs encouraging a form of social control, which is obviously completely abhorrent to any sane person.
Of course, our eminent criminologist Nils Christie has written a very good book on the prison gulag, as he calls it, in the USA.
And I'm sure he would. Yeah, and it's fascinating. And countries like the Netherlands are closing prisons because they don't prosecute. And that was one of the reasons, of course, why the Portuguese decriminalised all drugs, because they understood if you take crime out of drugs, you can save a lot of money, which we spent. So, and we've gone the opposite. In my country, moronically, we spent £500 million a year criminalising mostly young black people for possessing cannabis. And we could build 2 hospitals each year just for the price of that. It's completely redundant, and it is a form of social control. And occasionally people react against it, and we have riots, and then that's an excuse for even more control.
We have one more from the lady in the doorway.
Yes, my name is Trine Vik Agberg. I'm in psychosis research at the Oslo University Hospital.
Oh yeah.
And I just wondered if you'd like to comment on the growing evidence, the link between cannabis and psychosis, inducing psychotic disorders.
Yeah, really interesting question. Because so that was the reason my government upgraded cannabis. Where's she gone? The reason my government upgraded cannabis in 2008 was because they wanted to. It was a political decision. They were hunting around for a justification, and the justification they found was psychosis. Now, I didn't show you the data. I could show it tomorrow if you come to my talk tomorrow. But in the UK, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that cannabis use is associated with an increase in psychosis. So if you go back to 1971, when cannabis became controlled under the Misuse of Drugs Act, there were 500,000 cannabis users in the UK. And now we have 10 million. So there's been a 20-fold increase in cannabis use. And users and probably use, maybe more than that in use. So contrast that with the 60% increase in alcohol use, leading to a 5-fold increase in liver disease. That 20-fold increase in cannabis use has not been associated with any increase.
You lost sound.
Any increase in oh yes I did, because it fell out, So that 20-fold increase in cannabis use in my country and in all Western countries we know of has not been associated with any increase in either schizophrenia or psychosis. So the relationship is obviously not strong. But there is a clear relationship between using cannabis when you are psychotic and the nature of the experience of the psychosis. And I think that is a really interesting and fascinating example of how the medical profession has taken a decision that use is wrong. And I don't agree with them. Because when I talk to my patients, albeit I don't specialize in schizophrenia and psychosis, but when I've talked to my patients who do have psychosis, who do smoke cannabis, and I ask them the question, why do you smoke cannabis when you and I know that the voices get louder? They almost always say, because I can cope with them better. And so what is happening is that people with schizophrenia, you're talking about schizophrenia largely, not bipolar psychosis, but largely people with schizophrenia are using cannabis. And partly they're self-medicating. Because what cannabis does is as it does in them, as it does in you, it changes the way you interact with your mind. And for them, it can help them escape from the relentless drive that the voices or the delusions produce in them. So yes, it can make them worse, and that's a problem for doctors. But what doctors do, what you and I do, is we ask about these first-rank symptoms, and that's how we kind of define the nature of the illness and the status of our patients. But what we don't do enough is ask why they smoke cannabis. And the majority of them are not dependent, so they are smoking for some other reason. And some of it is about helping their brain do other things that they can't do on the neuroleptics, and some of it is obviously about the social environment they're in, where that's what other people do, and it helps them socialize. So I don't believe that cannabis is a cause of psychosis, but I do think it's a problem for doctors treating patients with psychosis.
Okay, do you cope with a few more
Yeah,
questions?
I'll stay here all day, yeah, that's why I've come.
I have Astrid's asking for a question again, and I would also like to post one myself. Astrid?
I think I just have it's Astrid Renman from Rossow, and I'm also a criminologist, so I'm very interested in your point of view on the political part of regulating cannabis and the harms of cannabis. But and I think I have a comment on, you said before that maybe Norway should be the leading country to make an international change in drug policy.
She's supporting my view that Norway should take the lead in changing the UN Convention.
I'm not sure. But and I think the situation in Norway is quite interesting because if you go 10 years back, we have just zero tolerance, and now 10 years after or today we have kind of a mix between, or we have partly zero tolerance and partly harm reduction. It means that both politics are kind of existing in the Norwegian drug policy together. And this also creates a very interesting situation where we have legalized heroin in a very limited.
You've legalized prescribing.
Yeah, no, not only prescribing. You can go to an injection room. And then you can use your own illegal heroin. You can use that in a legalized way. But we still have. It's really hard to suggest that we should decriminalize use of cannabis. And I think this is also a situation. I mean, even if you see that different countries have different way of regulating cannabis, and maybe in the practices they have, most countries have a decriminalized use of cannabis. But it's
not
still,
most, not most.
Yeah, and I think this is very interesting kind of what's going on with the international drug policy is the way that the worst thing, you talk about alcohol, you talk about heroin as the most harmful drugs.
Yeah.
And it's easier for politicians to go into a kind of decriminalizing of or legalizing of heroin than cannabis. Do you have any point of
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, well, you can tell me the answer to this. I mean, I guess the reason you now have injecting rooms is because people in this country who know the justification, the value of that, have persuaded the politicians. And you've managed to overcome the public perception that this is encouraging use. And, you know, you've put the harm reduction message out there, and you've won the argument. So great, fantastic, credit to you. And we haven't achieved that in the UK, sadly. You have to. I think the answer is you've got to. Probably the people that make the decisions about allowing that. I mean, is that done at a national level or is that done at a town level?
It's a national level.
So your politicians have understood that the harms of AIDS and the harms of dying from heroin injection are sufficiently high to warrant changing the law. I think you now have to persuade them that the harms that the law is doing to cannabis users are also sufficient to justify changing the law there. That would be the way I would go. If you want to, if they're interested in harms. Otherwise, you take a moral view. The moral view I would take is that it's morally wrong for a society to essentially force people who want to be intoxicated to use alcohol when there are safer alternatives. And I think that is also a very strong argument, but that is not one that politicians are very interested in hearing. But I think that, to be honest, that's the true argument, because now we constrain people to use alcohol, which is more dangerous than most of the drugs they would choose to use otherwise.
I have one question myself. I would like to get back to the construction of the assessment of harm, one single scale. And if we look at the scientific literature, there's been some debate there around using various criteria and collapsing these various harms together. And especially when thinking that you want this scale to have some implications on policy, I would assume that the values that policymakers have with respect to what weighs more or less might well be quite different from the values that are underlying your assessment when you are weighing the different kinds of harms.
Absolutely.
And if you look at the political rhetorics in many respects with respect to different kinds of drugs, it often seems that harms to others is a very heavy weighing argument in policy making. Did you underestimate harms to others, for instance?
For all the drugs other than alcohol?
Yes. No, for
because harm to alcohol, what was driving the high level of alcohol? That's the point.
You could have had alcohol even higher up.
Yeah, you could. I mean, you could take a view that it doesn't matter what people use themselves, and it's all that matters is the harm to society. And then alcohol would be even higher. You're absolutely right. And the great thing about this technology, and you can do this yourself if you want. If you go onto our website, you can access the data, and if you want, you can play around and change the weightings, and then you can see whether your own particular theories
Oh.
can be played out.
Okay, I'll do that. One final question to you.
Thank you. Relating to what Dusty was asking about, injection rooms we have, it has now, or almost a year ago in August 2012, the municipality of Oslo decided to establish not only injection rooms for heroin, but smoking rooms for heroin.
Oh yeah.
Yes, and the argument is that smoking it is less harmful than injecting it.
Unquestionably.
Yes.
Unquestionably.
But, as I keep saying, Western drug policies keep shedding paradoxes. And the paradox is, of course, that now we end up having legal smoking heroin, whereas there is absolutely no option whatsoever to smoke cannabis legally.
Yeah, no.
And that's a very strong paradox.
So that's driving people to heroin, you think? That's the argument you use to your politicians for liberalising. Use that argument. It might, I mean, it's conceivably, it could conceivably. I mean, it's very interesting because we know that happens in prisons. Now, I don't know what you do in prison here, but in Britain, we do the really stupid thing in prison. We decided we wanted to stop prisoners using drugs in prison. So we started drug testing them. This was about 8 years ago. And prisoners started getting caught for having cannabis in their urine. So and that meant that they, instead of getting parole, they had to serve longer terms. So what did the prisoners do? Well, they just switched to heroin, which has got a much shorter half-life and you're less likely. So these perverse consequences are there all the time. There's plenty of evidence for them, and that, and you do need a drugs policy which is comprehensive. You can't simply just pick it. So keep making that argument.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you in the audience for having so much good comments and questions, and to you, David, for
It's been a pleasure.
both your brilliant lecture and all your good answers and comments. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
One last word before we go. I would like to thank you again, David. And as you're not only here to do lectures, but also to see our country. And as the roads going north of Oslo are now closed because of the flood, so the only thing you'll see of our country is really this book. So therefore, a book instead of the visit. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll go and plan where to go.
Yes, absolutely.
That's great.